Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to StoryForge Network. I never thought I'd be telling this story from the other side of a hospital room, listening to the slow, mechanical breathing of a machine that was keeping me alive, while the person who was supposed to love me most stood at my bedside with disbelief carved into her face. Hospitals have a smell you never forget, a mix of antiseptic and stale air that makes time feel sticky. That night, the fluorescent lights hummed softly above me, and the heart monitor beside my bed beeped in a rhythm that had become oddly comforting. Each beep was proof that I was still here. My name is Daniel, and I was 36 years old when my sister Lena decided once again that I was lying. Lying about pain, lying about weakness, lying about being sick. According to her, I had made a lifetime habit of it. According to me, I was just tired of not being believed. The truth sat somewhere between us, heavy and unspoken, and it had been building since we were kids. Growing up, Lena was the strong one. She was 2 years older, taller by middle school, louder in every room. Our parents used to joke that she came out of the womb ready to argue with the doctor. I was the quieter child, the one who caught colds easily, the one who needed an inhaler during gym class and sat out while other kids ran laps. My mother would fuss over me, checking my forehead for fever, tucking blankets around my shoulders. Lena hated that. She never said it outright when we were young, but I could see it in her eyes whenever Mom canceled plans because I was sick again. By the time we were teenagers, Lena had started calling me fragile, not as a nickname, but as a verdict. If I complained of pain, she rolled her eyes. If I stayed home from school, she said I was milking it. Our parents tried to balance things, but they were tired, working long hours, and it was easier to believe Lena's confidence than my quiet protests. Over time, I learned to downplay everything. Headaches became nothing, chest tightness became stress, dizziness became dehydration. I didn't want to be the boy who cried sick. I wanted peace. Fast forward 20 years, and not much had changed except the stakes. Lena was now a successful real estate agent, sharp and unstoppable, the kind of woman who scheduled her life in color-coded blocks. I worked freelance graphic design from home, which to her meant I slept in and avoided real responsibility. When I started feeling exhausted all the time, she joked that it was because I finally had to face adulthood. When the chest pains came, she said it was anxiety. Even when I fainted in my kitchen one afternoon and cracked my head on the counter, she told me over the phone that I needed vitamins and a better routine. It was my wife Emma who insisted on the ER. Emma has a way of looking at me that feels like she's listening to things I'm not saying. That night, as the doctors ran tests and hooked me up to wires, I saw worry settle into her face like a storm cloud that refused to move. Lena arrived 2 hours later, heels clicking sharply against the hospital floor, irritation radiating off her like heat. She barely looked at me before asking Emma what I had done this time. I tried to joke it off, because that's what I always did, but my voice came out thin. The doctor explained that they were concerned about my heart rhythm, that they needed to monitor me overnight. Lena crossed her arms and sighed, muttering something about drama. Emma squeezed my hand, her grip firm, grounding me. They admitted me to a small room with one narrow window and a curtain that didn't quite close. The monitor was attached to my chest with sticky pads, wires snaking to the machine beside me. Each beep felt like reassurance. Lena sat in the corner, scrolling on her phone, occasionally glancing up with a look that said she was indulging a child's tantrum. When Emma went home to grab clothes and check on our dog, Lena finally spoke. She told me I couldn't keep doing this, that I couldn't keep dragging everyone into my imaginary crises. I told her I wasn't imagining anything. My chest hurt. I felt wrong. She laughed softly, a sound that cut deeper than shouting. She said I'd always been good at convincing myself of things. That was when I realized how alone I was in that room, despite not being physically alone. Hours passed. Night settled fully, the hallway outside quiet except for the occasional cart rolling by. Lena stood and walked over to my bed, her expression hard. She said she was going to prove a point, that if I stopped paying attention to the machines, I'd realize I was fine. Before I could ask what she meant, her hand reached out and pulled at the cord connecting my monitor. The beep stuttered, then stopped. She leaned in close and whispered, "You always fake being sick." Panic surged through me like ice water. I tried to speak, to call for a nurse, but my chest seized and my vision blurred. The silence where the beeping had been was terrifying. Lena straightened up, satisfied, unaware of the way my body was betraying me. That was the moment everything began to unravel, when years of disbelief collided with a truth neither of us could ignore anymore. The silence lasted only a second, maybe two, but it stretched inside my chest like an eternity. My heart didn't just skip a beat, it felt like it lost the map entirely. There was a hollow pressure behind my ribs, as if someone had scooped something vital out of me and forgotten to put it back. I remember reaching weakly toward the machine, my fingers trembling, my mouth opening without sound. Lena frowned, confused, annoyed that I wasn't reacting the way she expected. She probably thought I'd jump up and yell at her, prove her right by overreacting. Instead, my body slumped deeper into the mattress and a sharp, searing pain shot down my left arm. The room tilted. I heard a distant ringing, like a phone vibrating underwater. Lena's face shifted then, irritation cracking into uncertainty. She said my name once, slowly, like she was testing whether I'd answer. I didn't. My vision narrowed until all I could see was the fluorescent light above me, flickering slightly, and then even that began to dim. Somewhere outside the room, an alarm sounded, high and urgent, not from my machine, but from the nurse's station. Someone had noticed the flat line where a rhythm should have been. The door burst open, and suddenly the room filled with movement and voices. A nurse rushed to my side, fingers flying to reconnect the cord Lena had pulled. Another pressed buttons on the machine, calling out numbers I didn't understand. A doctor followed, calm but fast, his eyes sharp as they took in the scene. Lena stumbled backward, her hands still half raised in the air, like she'd been caught stealing something she didn't know how to return. I heard her say, he's always... But her words dissolved into the chaos. The monitor screamed back to life, a frantic, uneven rhythm replacing the comforting, steady beep from before. Oxygen was pressed over my face, cool and sharp, filling my lungs whether I wanted it to or not. Someone told me to stay with them, to keep my eyes open. I tried, but everything felt so heavy. Through the blur, I saw Lena's face drain of color. She looked small for the first time in my life. When the immediate crisis passed and my heart settled into something closer to normal, the doctor turned to Lena. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it that made even me flinch. He asked her why she had disconnected critical monitoring equipment. Lena stammered, saying she didn't know it was critical, that she thought it was just a display. The doctor didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He told her that my heart rhythm was unstable, that without the monitor and the medication it controlled, I could have gone into cardiac arrest. He said could have died like it was a simple fact, not an accusation. Lena's knees buckled and she had to grab the chair to stay upright. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of vindication, followed immediately by exhaustion so deep it scared me. This wasn't how I wanted to be believed. After they stabilized me, they asked Lena to step out. Emma arrived just as they were wheeling in additional equipment, her eyes wide with fear. She listened as the nurse explained what had happened, her gaze flicking briefly to Lena standing in the hallway, pale and shaking. Emma didn't say a word to her then. She just took my hand and pressed her forehead against it, breathing me in like she needed to reassure herself I was real. The doctor explained that I'd likely been living with an undiagnosed heart condition for years, one that could cause sudden rhythm disturbances, especially under stress. He said my symptoms weren't imaginary, weren't anxiety, weren't exaggeration. They were warning signs I'd been taught to ignore. As he spoke, memories flooded me, moments of pain brushed off, days I pushed through dizziness because I didn't want to be dramatic. Lena sat across the room later when they allowed her back in, her eyes red and rimmed with guilt. She didn't look at me at first. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. She said she was sorry. The word hung between us, fragile and insufficient. I wanted to scream, to ask her why it took almost killing me to listen. But I was too tired, and beneath the anger was something else, grief for the years we'd lost to misunderstanding. I told her I needed rest. That was the truth. Over the next few days, tests confirmed everything. I needed surgery. I needed medication. I needed to change my life. Lena visited every day, quieter than I'd ever known her. She brought coffee for Emma, magazines I didn't read, apologies she repeated like prayers. I didn't forgive her right away. Healing doesn't work on someone else's timeline. But as I lay there, listening to the steady beep of the monitor she no longer touched, I understood something important. Being believed shouldn't require proof this painful. My body had been telling the truth all along. The days after that incident blurred together in a haze of tests, needles, and conversations spoken in careful, serious tones. Each morning, a different specialist stood at the foot of my bed explaining another piece of the puzzle, another reason my heart had been misfiring for years. They used words like congenital, chronic, progressive. Words that suggested this wasn't something new or sudden, but something that had quietly grown with me, shaping my life while everyone, including me, pretended it wasn't there. I kept thinking about all the times I'd minimized my pain, laughed off my exhaustion, pushed myself past the point of safety just to avoid another eye roll. Lena sat in the corner during most of these explanations, her posture stiff, her hands clenched together in her lap. She asked questions now, a lot of them, her voice tight with urgency. It was strange to hear her advocate for me when she'd spent so long doubting me. Emma never left my side for long. She slept in the chair when they let her, her head tilted back uncomfortably, waking at every change in the room's sounds. At night, when the hallway lights dimmed and the hospital settled into its eerie quiet, my thoughts got louder. I replayed childhood memories through a new lens, moments when I'd cried in the nurse's office at school, moments when Lena had been sent back to class because she was fine. I wondered how different things might have been if someone had taken me seriously earlier. The surgeon came in on the third day to explain the procedure I'd need. He was gentle but direct, telling me that without intervention, I was at real risk of sudden cardiac events. Surgery sounded terrifying, but also like a strange relief, a concrete answer after decades of doubt. Lena couldn't meet my eyes during that conversation. When the doctor left, she finally broke down. She apologized again, but this time she didn't stop at sorry. She talked about how, growing up, she'd felt invisible whenever I was sick, how she'd learned to compete for attention by being strong, by dismissing weakness. She admitted that as adults, it was easier to believe I was exaggerating than to face the possibility that something was deeply wrong and she'd missed it. Listening to her, I felt a complicated mix of empathy and resentment. Her pain didn't erase mine, but it explained it. I told her that what hurt most wasn't just that she didn't believe me, but that she taught me not to believe myself. Those words landed heavily between us. She nodded, tears slipping down her face, and for the first time, she didn't argue. The night before my surgery, fear settled into my bones. Emma held my hand, whispering plans for the future like promises she was determined to keep. I realized then how lucky I was to have someone who listened when my body spoke, even when I couldn't articulate it. The surgery itself passed in fragments of memory, bright lights, masked faces, then darkness. When I woke up, sore and disoriented, the first sound I heard was that familiar beep, steady and strong. Recovery was slow. Pain forced me to rest in a way I never had before. Lena visited, but she gave me space, respecting boundaries she was only just learning to see. One afternoon, she brought a box of old photos. We laughed softly at hairstyles and clothes from another era. It felt like rediscovering each other without the weight of old roles. As my strength returned, so did clarity. I realized that survival wasn't just about fixing my heart, it was about unlearning the habit of self-doubt. Before I was discharged, the doctor reminded me that listening to my body wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Lena stood beside me as I packed my things, her arm hovering awkwardly, unsure whether to help. I told her we'd need time, but that I was willing to try. She nodded, relief washing over her face. Walking out of the hospital, sunlight felt different, sharper, more precious. I carried scars now, visible and invisible, but I also carried something else, the right to trust my own experience. That was something no one could unplug again. Coming home felt both comforting and frightening. The familiar creak of the stairs, the smell of our living room, the way sunlight spilled across the couch where I'd collapsed so many afternoons, pretending I was just tired. It all looked the same. But I wasn't. My body moved slower, more deliberately, every step a reminder that I had crossed some invisible line and couldn't go back. Emma hovered without hovering, if that makes sense, always nearby but careful not to make me feel fragile. She learned my new medications faster than I did, lining them up on the counter like tiny sentinels guarding my future. Lena came by the second evening after I was discharged. She stood at the doorway like a guest, unsure of her welcome. I invited her in and we sat at the kitchen table where we'd once argued about everything from borrowed clothes to borrowed money. She watched me swallow my pills, her eyes tracking every movement, guilt still etched deep into her face. She asked how I felt, and for once, when I said I was tired, she didn't challenge it. That small change mattered more than she knew. As the weeks passed, I started cardiac rehab, slow walks monitored by professionals who believed data more than bravado. Each session was humbling. I had to relearn what effort felt like, what pain meant, what limits were reasonable. Sometimes when my chest tightened, panic flared, memories of that night in the hospital crashing back. Emma would remind me to breathe, to trust the doctors, to trust myself. Lena came to one session, sitting quietly in the corner, her presence a mix of support and penance. Afterwards, she told me she'd never realized how much strength it took to slow down. Our conversations changed after that. We talked less about the past and more about who we were becoming. She admitted she'd built her identity on being invincible, and seeing me vulnerable and surviving had cracked something open in her. There were still awkward moments, missteps, old habits resurfacing, but there was also effort. One afternoon, months later, I felt a familiar ache and decided to rest instead of pushing through. Lena happened to be there. She watched me lie down, concern flickering across her face, and asked if I needed anything. No sarcasm, no doubt, just care. That was when I knew we were healing. Not perfectly, but honestly. My scars faded from angry red to pale reminders. The bigger change was inside. I spoke up more. I canceled plans without apology. I listened when my body whispered instead of waiting for it to scream. And Lena listened too. The sister who once pulled my monitor cord now checked in before assuming, asked before judging. We were learning each other again, stripped of old narratives. The moral of my story isn't just about medical neglect or sibling rivalry. It's about belief, about how dangerous it can be when someone teaches you that your pain isn't real. If you're listening to this and you've ever been told you're exaggerating, that it's all in your head, please hear me now. Your body tells the truth, and you deserve to be believed before it takes a crisis to prove it.
Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges, but it doesn't erase them. Instead, it teaches you how to run your fingers along the scars without flinching. About 6 months after my surgery, life began to resemble something close to normal, though I'd learned that normal was no longer a fixed destination. It was a moving thing, something I had to renegotiate every day. Some mornings I woke up energized, hopeful, almost forgetful of everything I'd been through. Other days, exhaustion clung to me like fog, and I had to remind myself that resting wasn't quitting. Emma returned to her routine slowly too, though I could tell the experience had changed her just as deeply. She checked in with me more gently now, asking how I felt instead of assuming, listening not just to my words, but to my pauses. Lena tried to find her place in this new version of our family. She called more often, sometimes just to ask about my day, other times to share things she'd never talked about before. One evening, she admitted she'd started therapy. She says she needed to understand why she'd been so angry for so long, why weakness in others felt like a personal attack. Hearing that cracked something open in me. For the first time, I saw her not as my antagonist, but as someone carrying her own quiet wounds. That didn't erase what happened, but it allowed space for something like forgiveness to grow. We didn't rush it. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't a switch you flip. It's a muscle you strengthen slowly. There were setbacks. Once, during a family gathering, I stepped outside to catch my breath, and Lena joked too quickly that I was being dramatic. The old sting hit instantly, but she saw my face change and stopped herself, apologizing without prompting. That mattered. Progress isn't perfection, it's awareness. As my confidence in my body returned, so did my voice. I began sharing my story more openly, first with close friends, then in a small online support group for people with chronic conditions. Reading others' experiences, I realized how common disbelief was, how many people had been told to toughen up, to stop complaining, until their bodies forced the truth into the open. That shared understanding felt like community. Lena listened when I talked about those stories, really listened. She told me it made her rethink how she treated clients, friends, even herself. Strength, she said, didn't have to mean denial. On the anniversary of my hospitalization, we visited the hospital together. It wasn't planned. We just found ourselves driving past it, then pulling into the parking lot. We sat in the car for a long moment. Lena finally said she still heard the silence after the monitor stopped beeping in her nightmares. I did too. We sat with that shared memory, not to punish ourselves, but to honor how close we'd come to losing everything. Walking back to the car, I felt something settle inside me, a sense that the story no longer owned me. I owned it, and I could use it to remind others and myself that listening to your body, to the people you love, is an act of care that can save lives. As the second year after my surgery unfolded, life didn't slow down the way I once imagined recovery would make it. Instead, it deepened. Ordinary moments carried more weight, more texture. A quiet breakfast with Emma felt like a small victory. A walk around the block felt earned. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could endure and started measuring it by how honestly I could live. That shift didn't come easily. Old instincts die hard. There were days I wanted to push past my limits just to prove I could, especially when people praised my comeback or told me how strong I was. Strength had become a complicated word for me. Lena noticed those moments before I did. She'd gently ask if I was okay or suggest we sit down, and every time she did, I felt a strange mix of gratitude and grief. Gratitude that she was paying attention now, grief that it had taken so much pain to get here. Our relationship settled into something quieter, more intentional. We didn't talk every day, but when we did, the conversations were real. She told me about work pressures, about how she was learning to say no without apologizing. I told her about my fears, the lingering worry that my heart might betray me again. We were learning how to be siblings without the old roles dictating every interaction. One afternoon, she admitted something that stopped me cold. She said she'd always been afraid that if she acknowledged my pain, it would make her confront her own vulnerability. Dismissing me had been a way to protect herself. Hearing that didn't excuse what she'd done, but it gave it context. And context, I've learned, is the soil where empathy grows. Around that time, I started speaking at small community health events, sharing my story with people who recognized pieces of themselves in it. Each time I spoke, I felt a little more whole. Lena attended one of those talks quietly, sitting in the back. Afterwards, she hugged me tightly and told me she was proud, not of my endurance, but of my honesty. That distinction meant everything. Emma and I talked about the future differently now. We planned with flexibility, leaving room for rest and unpredictability. We learned that joy didn't have to be loud or dramatic to be real. Sometimes it was just sitting together in silence, listening to my heart beat steadily, reliably. I still have moments of anger when I think about that night in the hospital, about how close I came to losing my life because I wasn't believed. But anger no longer consumes me. It informs me. It reminds me why it matters to speak up, to insist on care, to trust myself even when others don't. Lena still carries guilt, I know that. I see it in the way she double checks, the way she pauses before joking. I don't try to take that away from her. Some lessons are meant to be carried, not erased. What matters is that we carry them forward differently. When I look at my life now, I don't see a tragedy narrowly avoided. I see a turning point, a moment that forced all of us to listen more closely. And if this story does anything, I hope it teaches you this. Disbelief can wound deeply, but belief, real attentive belief, has the power to heal in ways medicine alone never can. The third year after everything happened brought a quiet test I didn't see coming. Not a medical emergency, not a dramatic relapse, but something subtler and, in its own way, harder. Life had finally stabilized. My heart was steady. My routines were familiar. The people around me had learned how to treat me without walking on eggshells. And yet, beneath that calm, I felt the lingering fear that all of this belief, all of this care, was temporary. That one wrong moment would snap us back into old patterns. It started with something small, a dull ache in my chest one morning that didn't escalate, but didn't disappear either. Old instincts flared immediately. Don't make a fuss. Don't overreact. You're probably fine. I went through half the day pretending it wasn't there, smiling through conversations, answering emails, even laughing at a joke Lena made over lunch. She was visiting, sitting across from me at the table, when she noticed I kept touching my chest absent-mindedly. She asked if I was okay. The question itself caught me off guard. It wasn't sharp or skeptical. It was open. I hesitated, feeling that old fear rise up, the fear of being seen as dramatic, as difficult. Then I told her the truth. I said I didn't know if it was serious, but it didn't feel right. She didn't panic. She didn't dismiss it. She suggested we check in with my doctor, just to be safe. The simplicity of that moment almost undid me. No judgment, no assumptions, just care. We went together. The tests showed it was nothing dangerous, just muscle strain combined with stress. Relief washed over me, but something else did too. Pride. Not because I'd pushed through, but because I'd spoken up. Lena noticed that too. On the drive home, she said she was glad I'd said something, even though it turned out to be minor. She told me she was learning that belief wasn't about being right, it was about being present. That sentence stayed with me. Later that year, our parents visited, older now, slower, carrying their own regrets quietly. My mother apologized one evening, her voice trembling as she admitted she should have listened better when we were kids. My father nodded, eyes downcast. Lena reached for my hand during that conversation, a silent acknowledgement of shared responsibility and shared growth. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was honest. As the year drew to a close, I realized something profound. The story no longer centered on the moment my sister pulled that cord. It centered on everything that came after, the choices we made when confronted with truth, the way we learned, slowly and imperfectly, to listen. I had spent so much of my life doubting my own experience because someone I loved taught me to.
Now I was surrounded by people who had learned to do better, including myself. If you're listening to this and you're still stuck in that place of self-doubt, waiting for proof dramatic enough to justify your pain, I want you to know this. You don't need a crisis to deserve care. You don't need a witness who finally believes you after the damage is done. Your experience is valid right now. And in the final part of this story, I want to share what true closure looked like for us and how forgiveness finally took shape in a way I never expected. Closure doesn't arrive like a door slamming shut. It comes more like a window opening slowly, letting in air you didn't realize you'd been holding your breath for. For me, true closure came on an ordinary afternoon, years after the hospital room, years after the cord and the silence and the almost ending. Linga and I were sitting on my back porch, the kind of quiet day where nothing dramatic happens and everything important does. Emma was inside making tea. The sky was overcast, soft gray, the kind that makes the world feel gentle instead of heavy. Lena had come over to help me move some old boxes from the garage, boxes we'd both avoided for a long time. Inside them were pieces of our shared past, school papers, photo albums, random keepsakes our parents had insisted we take. We opened one box together and found a childhood drawing I'd made of the two of us holding hands. I looked sickly even in crayon form, thin and pale, while Lena was drawn tall and smiling. We both laughed quietly, but then she went silent. She traced the paper with her finger and said something that finally tied everything together. She said she was sorry not just for that night in the hospital, but for all the little moments before it. Every eye roll, every joke, every time she taught me that my pain was an inconvenience. She said she understood now that pulling that cord hadn't been an accident of ignorance. It had been the end result of years of disbelief. Hearing her say that without defensiveness, without rushing to soften it, felt like something unclenched deep inside me. I told her that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing not to live in that moment forever. We sat there for a long time, listening to distant traffic, to birds settling in the trees. When Emma came out with the tea, she set the cups down and sat beside me, her presence steady as always. Lena thanked her, too, for believing me when it mattered most. Emma just nodded and said, "I listened because he needed me to." That was it. No grand speech, just truth. As the years have gone on, my heart condition remains part of my life, but it no longer defines it. I manage it. I respect it. I don't hide it. And when something feels off, I say so, loudly if I need to. Lena has become one of my strongest advocates, not out of guilt anymore, but out of genuine understanding. She corrects people when they minimize symptoms. She listens more than she talks. She's learned that strength isn't about denying pain, it's about responding to it with care. Looking back, I see how close I came to disappearing, not just physically, but emotionally, how disbelief can slowly erase a person from the inside out. And I see how belief, once it finally arrived, gave me more than survival. It gave me my voice back. If there's one lesson I want you to carry with you from my story, it's this. Your pain does not need permission to exist. You don't need to convince anyone with drama or proof or crisis. If something feels wrong, it deserves attention. And if you're the one listening to someone else, remember that belief is powerful. Sometimes it's life-saving. My sister and I will never be who we were before that hospital room, and that's okay. We're better now, wiser, kinder, more honest. The beep of a heart monitor no longer haunts me. Instead, it reminds me that I'm still here, still breathing, still worthy of being believed. I used to think survival was the end of the story, that once you made it through the worst moment, everything else was just aftermath, a slow fade back into ordinary life. But what I've learned since then is that survival is really the beginning of a different kind of work. It's the moment you're handed your life back and told quietly that what you do with it now matters. Years have passed since that hospital room, and sometimes I'm startled by how far away it feels and how close it still lives inside me. My days are full in ways I never expected. I still work from home, but now I structure my time around my body instead of forcing my body to obey my schedule. I take breaks without guilt. I cancel plans when I need to.
I no longer explain myself endlessly. That alone has been a kind of freedom I didn't know I was allowed to claim. Emma and I grew stronger in the quiet ways that don't photograph well. We learned how to talk about fear without letting it dominate us. We learned how to sit with uncertainty and still make plans. Sometimes we revisit that night in the hospital, not because it haunts us, but because it reminds us how fragile and precious belief really is. Lena remains a steady presence in my life, not perfect, not transformed into some idealized version of a sister, just real. She still struggles sometimes with slowing down, with sitting in discomfort, but she no longer runs from it by denying it in others. I see the way she listens now, not just to me, but to the people around her. She's become the person who notices when someone goes quiet, who asks follow-up questions, who doesn't rush to label pain as weakness. Watching that change has been one of the most unexpected gifts to come out of all of this. Our parents, too, have changed in small but meaningful ways. My mother checks in more thoughtfully now, asking how I feel and waiting for the answer instead of filling the silence with reassurance. My father listens in that quiet, serious way of his, nodding slowly, as if he's finally hearing a language he once ignored. None of them can undo the past, but they've all learned how to show up differently in the present. And so have I. The biggest change, though, has been internal. I no longer negotiate with my pain, no longer argue it down like it's an enemy I need to defeat. I treat it like information, like a signal worth paying attention to. That shift has changed everything. It's made me more compassionate, not just toward myself, but toward others whose struggles aren't visible or convenient. I've learned that disbelief often says more about the listener than the speaker, and belief, real belief, costs very little but offers so much. Sometimes I imagine an alternate version of my life, one where that hospital moment never happened, where my condition remained hidden, where I kept pushing and minimizing and doubting until one day my heart simply stopped. That thought still chills me, but I don't live there. I live here, in this version of my life, where I survived, where I learned, where relationships fractured and then rebuilt themselves into something sturdier and more honest. If you're listening to this now, maybe you're at the beginning of your own story. Maybe you're still being told you're exaggerating, that it's all in your head, that you're making a big deal out of nothing. Or maybe you're the one doing the doubting, the one who's learned to equate strength with silence. Wherever you are, I want you to know this. Belief is not weakness, listening is not surrender, and taking pain seriously, whether it's your own or someone else's, can change the entire course of a life. My sister once pulled a cord and accused me of faking. Today, she's one of the people who reminds me to rest, to speak up, to trust myself. That didn't happen overnight. It happened because we chose, again and again, to listen instead of dismiss, to learn instead of defend, to believe instead of assume. This is where my story settles now, not in anger, not even in forgiveness alone, but in understanding, and in the quiet, steady rhythm of a heart that finally feels heard. I never expected that the hardest part of my life would teach me the most important lesson about love, trust, and belief. Sitting here now, years after the night my sister pulled the hospital monitor cord, I realized that moment was more than just a crisis. It was a turning point that reshaped not just my body, but my mind, my relationships, and the way I understood myself. For years after, I replayed that night in my head. I imagined every possibility, every choice that could have led to something worse, every what if that might have been my last. I would lie awake thinking about the cold gleam in Lena's eyes when she pulled the cord, about the way I felt utterly powerless, my heart stuttering without the machine's steady guidance. But as painful as it was to relive, I've come to understand that moment wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of something larger, something harder and more beautiful than survival alone. Recovery, both physically and emotionally, was slow. It demanded more patience than I thought I had. The weeks after my surgery were full of pain, confusion, and fear.
My body didn't respond the way I expected. Some days I could barely get out of bed. I had to relearn the simplest tasks, walking without feeling like my chest might cave in, managing my medications without forgetting a dose, sitting up without feeling dizzy. But those physical struggles were nothing compared to the emotional work that came after. Every time I thought I could finally relax, a pang of old fear would surface. I worried about fainting, about pushing myself too hard, about being disbelieved once again. It was exhausting to navigate the world in a body that had betrayed me and a mind that had learned to distrust it. Lena's presence in that recovery phase was complicated. She wanted to help, but she didn't always know how. At first, she hovered awkwardly, offering advice I didn't ask for, second-guessing my choices in subtle ways. There were moments I felt resentful. After all, she had doubted me for decades. She had dismissed my pain, laughed at my exhaustion, and then almost killed me by unplugging the monitor. And yet, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to change. She started asking questions instead of giving answers. She asked how I felt, not how I thought I should feel. She asked what I needed, not what she assumed I needed. That shift was almost imperceptible at first, but over time it became the foundation for a new kind of relationship between us, one that was built not on rivalry or disbelief, but on genuine care. Emma's role during this period cannot be overstated. She became my anchor, the steady voice in the chaos of recovery. When my heart fluttered in ways I couldn't describe, she stayed with me. When fear threatened to overwhelm me, she reminded me that my feelings were valid, that my experiences were real, and that I didn't have to hide them to protect anyone else. She encouraged me to speak up, to advocate for myself, to refuse the old patterns of minimization and self-doubt. Through her unwavering support, I began to reclaim parts of myself I had long buried: my voice, my confidence, my ability to trust my own body and mind. The process of forgiveness was even slower than the physical recovery. I didn't forgive Lena immediately, not in the hospital, not in the weeks afterward. The anger lingered, simmering beneath the surface, a reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. But over time, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolving her actions. It wasn't about pretending the past didn't hurt. It was choosing not to let that hurt define the present or the future. I forgave Lena not because she deserved it in that moment, but because I deserved peace. I forgave her because continuing to carry that weight would have crushed the fragile equilibrium I was struggling to maintain. One of the most powerful moments in our journey came unexpectedly. It was a rainy afternoon, months after my surgery, and Lena and I were sorting through old family photos in my attic. She held a picture of us as children, me small and pale in a too-big sweater, and her beaming, with her arm draped over my shoulders. "I was jealous of you," she admitted quietly. "I didn't want to admit it. You got attention for being sick, for being fragile, and I hated that. I hated feeling like I was invisible, so I made it about me instead." I stared at her, my chest tightening, not from my heart condition, but from the raw honesty in her words. For the first time, I saw her fear and her shame in a way I hadn't before. I could understand her motives without excusing them. I could empathize without erasing my own pain. We spent hours in that attic, uncovering old letters, school projects, and keepsakes. We laughed at the absurdity of our childhood dramas and cried quietly at moments we'd both misremembered or misunderstood. For the first time, our shared history felt less like a battlefield and more like a tapestry, messy, imperfect, but ours. That day, I realized something crucial. Healing doesn't just happen in moments of crisis. It happens in the small, consistent acts of listening, of presence, of empathy. It happens when someone chooses to show up again and again, even after mistakes, even after betrayal. The years following that attic moment were filled with these quieter, yet more meaningful victories.
Lena became more intentional in her life, more reflective about how she treated others, and more mindful of her own emotional blind spots. She checked in with me regularly, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to understand and support me. My parents, too, showed their growth in subtle ways. They stopped dismissing minor complaints, stopped assuming I was exaggerating, and began listening with patience and attention. Slowly, the entire family learned to value vulnerability as a strength rather than a weakness. I also found a new purpose in sharing my story with others. I began speaking at health workshops, support groups, and online forums for people with chronic or invisible illnesses. Every time I shared my experience, I saw someone in the audience breathe a little easier, nod in recognition, or whisper quietly to themselves that they weren't alone. Those moments reinforced what I had learned firsthand. Disbelief can wound deeply, but belief, real empathetic belief, can be transformative. It can save lives. It can rebuild trust. It can restore hope. Even now, I carry a quiet vigilance in my life. I pay attention to the signals my body gives me, I listen to my instincts, and I speak up when something feels wrong. But the difference is profound. I no longer approach life from a place of fear or shame. I approach it with awareness, gratitude, and self-respect. I've understood that my body is not an adversary, but a guide. I've learned to distinguish between discomfort and danger, between tiredness and alarm. I've learned to advocate for myself without apology. The final lesson of this journey is the one I wish I could have told my younger self in that hospital room. You are worthy of being believed. Your experiences are valid, even if the people around you doubt them. Pain, illness, and vulnerability are not failures. They are truths that deserve acknowledgement. And the people who truly love you will learn to listen, will learn to show up, and will grow with you, even if it takes years. Today, when I look at Lena, I don't see the sister who pulled the cord in anger or disbelief. I see the sister who grew, who learned, who stood beside me when it mattered most. I see the woman who learned to listen before judging, who learned that strength doesn't mean denial, and who has over time become one of my most steadfast allies. We are no longer trapped in old patterns of rivalry, accusation, or misunderstanding. We have built something new: trust, empathy, and a cautious but real forgiveness. And so my story closes not with tragedy, but with clarity. I survived not because of medicine or luck, but because of the people who finally listened, and because I found the courage to trust myself. My life now is measured not in fear or pain, but in awareness, compassion, and choice. Every heartbeat is a reminder, every breath a quiet triumph. I carry the lessons of that night with me every day, letting them guide the way I live, love, and believe, not just in others, but in myself. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this: never let disbelief define you. Stand firm in your truth. Speak even when it's hard. And if you are in the position to listen, do so fully. Because in the end, the heart that is finally heard is a heart that can keep beating steady and strong.